I'm Jon Utley. I was born in Moscow in 1934. My father was Russian, my mother was English. I'm here because when I was born, they knew already Russian babies could not leave the country without special permission. So when I was born, my mother put me on her passport as a British, she was English, as a British subject. So it was already dangerous then. They knew many people had been arrested. The handwriting was on the wall, and my father was arrested 2 years later. The secret police came at 2 o'clock in the morning, knock on the door. They spent 3 or 4 hours going through every bit of paper and book and everything in the small apartment. Everyone had small apartments. And then took my father away, and my mother never saw him again, nor even knew why he was arrested. There were never reasons given. Investigation, they called it. And that was the end of the people on the whole. And then my mother left a few weeks later. She tried to get him to take food and clothing, a change of clothing for him, which she did to the prison, but then she was afraid they'd come for me or prevent me from leaving, being born in Russia. They don't recognize non-nationality. So she got out to London, where she was English, in 1936, and actually went back to Russia to try to do something for my father, but could not. However, to understand, my father was a high official with the Russian trade delegations. He'd been in London and then Japan with the Soviet embassy as a trade official, and then my mother was a writer and in England, and had written a number of books and was fairly well known. So she also had a fairly high profile. And what's interesting, we get into the story, I went back a few years ago. One could find the documents of what happened to people. Nobody really knew. And my mother had later had continued as a writer and wrote some of the first anti-communist books explaining what life was like in Russia. And she was connected then in Washington. Llewellyn Thompson was an former ambassador, asked Mikoyan, who was a top Soviet, what had happened to my father, if he could get a record. And we got a little letter from the Soviet embassy saying he had died in the state of Komi, that's northern Russia, this side of the Urals, with as big as France. I mean, that he died in 1938 in the state of Komi. That's all we knew. So many years later, I went back. A Russian friend of mine, a professor here, had told me, now you can find the documents of what happened. So he went first, and then I followed, and we went to the FSB, which was the KGB, that's the secret police, archives in Moscow, where they've got tremendous building with all the files. What's astounding for us, for people who were not familiar with it, was the records they kept, a tremendous record keeping. And it's in Anne Applebaum's book, Gulag, which anyone should read to know. And so they had the records. I held the file in my hands. There's a picture. We have a little website, fredautley.com, FREDAUTLEY.com, and there's a picture there of me holding the file of my father's arrest records. And they had a picture there. The best picture I have of is his mugshot when he was arrested, because it had been in the file for 60 years. And we found the documents, and they said, well, there's more in northern Russia, in the state of, in the city of Ukhta, in the state of Komi. That was the concentration camp, labor camp, they called them, center of administration. And we went there later, and I had the file there. I had a little card a 5x7 card about who he was that was from their files. And then it had a note transferred to the 3rd Department. I think, if my memory is correct, 3rd Department meant execution. And learned then there were documents that he had been one of the leaders of a hunger strike in the prison camps, and then was executed along with several others. There were 17 in their group, were executed, went to Vorkuta. I went with my Russian translator, and there's a group in Russia called Memorial, which is it's a human rights group, but it was tracking and making records and finding what had happened to all the people who were arrested. You know, it's millions. And they had representatives in different cities, and in Vorkuta was two, they had a tiny office and 2 people there who, after I went, began to research what had happened, because there are files. Well, it turns out that there was a place called the Brick Quarry, B-R-I-C-K. In Solzhenitsyn's book, Gulag Archipelago, he mentions the Brick Quarry, where 2,000 to 3,000 people were executed for being troublemakers in the camps. And my father, they learned, had been one of those. But nobody had been there. Nobody knew where it was, the Brick Quarry, because this is in the Arctic. Even though it's cold, the growing season is fast, and things get grown over by it's called the taiga, is this vegetation, which is about a foot or 2 thick, but grows fast and covers everything. Anyway, after I'd been there, then they started researching, and they found this place that Solzhenitsyn said nobody, they didn't know where it was. They found the Brick Quarry. And then when I went, I was twice, we walked out to this place where the men and women had been executed in groups of 40. The Soviets sent special execution squads from Moscow to do it. It took out 3,000. It's 2,000 to 3,000 were shot by machine gun fire, and the bodies left there. Let me add, they were sent to us. The Russian embassy in Moscow finally sent us the files in Russian. We have translated them, and they're on the FridaUtley.com website. And in there you see that he was executed for the hunger strike, for leading. My story is a tiny one. Millions of people had this. When the secret police took all these people, it's in Anne Applebaum's book, they took up everybody, especially the intellectuals, the top engineers. They had arrested a man, Tupolev, who was one of the best aircraft designers in Russia, a plane named for him. Another man, whose name I have in my writings, but who became head of the whole Soviet space program, had been up in Kolyma. That was the worst one on the Pacific coast, and lost his teeth to scurvy. There's no food. And then suddenly someone got to Stalin and said, our engineers, all the top people, are being arrested. So they went around and got them out. When they were taking people, once you let the police, us immigrants love the Bill of Rights in America. I mean, thank God, because you let the police handle what they want, and they started arresting everybody. Somebody said something, and then when I had the files of my father, there were envelopes that were sealed. They said, you can't open those. So I was in their library, even 50, 60 years later. A friend of mine who follows this, he said those were probably testimony by friends or acquaintances that gave accusations, because everybody was trying to save their own skin. You know, communism. And so they kept that. Even today, that was secret, who had denounced him, perhaps, sort of thing. He was the 2nd or 3rd man in the Russian government import-export organization. And one story, you get different stories, was that they were investigating. The government would switch policies, and then people would get caught up. Well, and their enemies would denounce them. You violated the new policy. They were exporting coal. they said it was to investigate exports of coal that shouldn't have been done or something like that. But once they had somebody, you know, there was a famous a Russian general said, "Send us the man and we'll find the crime." You hear that a little bit today. There's so many laws in America. Some people say we violate something. In any case, there was serious business. And once they had somebody, they'd investigate. Now, also at that time, Stalin was really liquidating the Russians who knew about the outside world, of which my father had served in England. He'd lived in America. He'd studied in Switzerland. Then he came to America, and then he went back and worked for the Russian Soviet embassy as an accountant. He was a business accounting, and not a spy, I might add, and not a member of the Communist Party. In the documents, when they arrested him, they were surprised with his high position that he was not a member of the party. My mother had joined the English Communist Party in 1926 or 7, and that happened because she was English, as I say. She'd grown up. She went to work at 16. Her father died in 16 in what was called the War Department in the First World War. That was what they used to call them. Now they're called defense departments. And she became president of the labor union of the clerks and typists in there. And then she'd been leftist because you have to think England was going through terrible times in the 20s. After the First World War, they tried to go back on the pound to be the trade center of the world, and they went into a depression in England in the 20s. Cutting wages, the coal miners were cut 10%, and there were giant strikes. And she was very sympathetic to the leftists. And then when she went to Moscow, at first in Russia, Lenin had confiscated, and it was the communism we know. But then the economy was such a disaster, they had a thing called New Economic Policy, and allowed freedom and property rights, and Russia immediately began to flourish. And my mother visited there in 1926 or 7, and it looked like communism worked, which later obviously it worked in one sense, but it looked, there was some prosperity, and England looked so bad, so she joined the British Communist Party, never transferred her membership, but was sympathetic to those things. And I grew up with stories, one of which was the communist thing. The communists were going to rationalize industry. Instead of having 6 companies producing a product, you just have one, the government would oversee it, and that would be more efficient. And I remember her stories when she got to Moscow. A peasant would spend the whole day to bring a melon into Moscow. Food was so scarce. It was worthwhile. Their system was so mixed up. It would pay a peasant to spend a day on the train bringing a melon in so he could sell it in Moscow. That was the kind of efficiency they had in the end. The thing about communism is that they say the story is a revolution devours its own. Stalin feared actually the early communists, who were idealistic people. And those were the ones that were liquidated among the first. People who were dedicated and brave. And so she knew in 1929 already that there were stories of their friends and people being arrested and disappearing. So she had tried to tell my father, don't come back, but he didn't believe it, and that was. They'd been together seven years and much in love, but it was already, people lived in terror because so many friends had been arrested. And then she'd become anti-communist. Once she lived in Moscow and saw this, she was against them. And so she always feared, because she talked a lot, and that someone had, it was reported that you'd said things against the government or criticized them, or even jokes, people were put in prison. I mean, Americans don't, could never understand, nor perhaps should we. But it's hard. People from that era out of East Europe, they don't often talk about it because explaining it was so painful to people who had no concept of what tyranny is. So it was generally they would talk among each other, and but it was hard to explain in America. People just, it's beyond the ken, you know. I think understanding communism, a very major part of understanding it is to understand it succeeded because they could isolate their people. The news was, there was no news, remember. I went back to Russia in 1987, the first time, and I took a shortwave radio, thinking I'd listen, a radio, rather, just a regular radio, not shortwave, to Moscow in '87. That's communism, been there a long time. There was no FM radio, which was already big in the West, and only 3 stations, and a repeater, say 4 stations, on AM radio. That was all the news anybody got. Now, later I was on the Voice of America. I became, in the Reagan times, they put me on because I knew communism. And from my mother, and I'd written in Latin America. And shortwave, you can't understand. Everybody who would have a shortwave radio to listen to news from the outside. And I might add television. There was nothing reporting of, other than what the government wanted. So communism worked because they were isolated. And once it became open, what's underestimated in the collapse of communism is the VCR, simple sounding. I was on the Voice of America. The Reagan people put me on at the end of '84. But VCRs, when they came out, every Soviet diplomat would go back to Russia with 2 VCRs, one to keep and one to sell for thousands of dollars. And the VCR and then the underground distribution of videos was an incredibly undermining factor in Russia because people could see the outside world. Well, I knew he died and killed, so it was going out to where the executions took place, which are open fields outside of Vorkuta. In the summer, it's beautiful. There's a river there and all. What I felt first, a certain peacefulness sort of coming. You know, it lays to rest. Well, what happened to him? We never knew where his body was, what had happened. So there was a certain peacefulness, one. And then what went through my head was also, if it had been me, would I prefer to, he was executed, would you prefer to be executed or die of starvation and cold, in the cold, and it's freezing? That occurred to me. I'd rather be shot too. I was interviewed by a Russian paper later, and they said, do you want to find the people who did this to your father? And I said, no, you know, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. If you're consumed with vengeance, you know, and of course they were all dead anyway. There wasn't anything I could do. But especially it was a sort of tranquility that finding what happened. You have to think my mother never knew all that. But no prisoner lasted more than a year or 2. There hardly any food, terrible conditions, the cold. You have to appreciate how cold can be. And no one lasted long, you know, in those days. So it was really, it wasn't a choice. It was a question of how one died, not dying. Well, I think it's immensely important to know what's out there, especially for Americans. I mean, no one understands. And I've been active here. I joke the Bill of Rights. Now there's only 5 of them left. The government's already been squeezing them. Like the 4th Amendment is privacy issues, etc. So knowing what happened in other countries. Now, it's focused, so much is focused on the Holocaust, which was mainly Jewish, but definitely not just Jews, many others. And so the Russian thing is sort of forgotten, and then it still has an ideal. The Soviet thing was never reported like the Holocaust. So you really want to know, in terms of preserving our own freedoms, it's so beyond comprehension that that could ever happen in America. And I don't think it could ever be like that bad. But the most of human history, and especially the 20th century, or rather particularly the 20th century, the greatest threat to most people was their own government. It wasn't foreigners coming and killing them, it was their own government. Early memories of my life, the third or fourth memory is coming to the United States. I was 5 years old. We were on a Dutch ship when the war had started. My mother got me out to England in 1936, and in 1939 we came to America. And then one of my earliest memories is everybody so excited arriving in New York Harbor, and the ship was tipping to one side with all the passengers, everyone on one side, and I remember coming up afraid of it, and they would tip over, and I went putting my weight. I thought I'd balance it a bit. But what I want to say, the excitement of coming to America, and I choke up still with the words on the Statue of Liberty. If I repeat them, I choke, even what it meant for people escaping this to. There were many refugees, of course, on the trip, on the boat. And what it meant coming to America was just so fantastic. I didn't really understand that, but I knew everybody was very excited.